Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Dying Your Way podcast. I am thrilled to finally get this guest with us today. She is quite busy in all of her irons that she has in very many fires here in Western Australia. Her name is Leanne O'Shea, and she is the founder of the Grief and Bereavement Centre that is in Boyanup in Western Australia. And I met Leanne at the Dying to Know Day that was a couple of years ago. It was before the pandemic. And she was leading a grief group, really. And I was so just mesmerized and touched by how soft and gentle and open she was to everyone and listened to what was being said in such a tender way that it really it was just a very moving experience for everybody that was there, but certainly for me. And then our paths crossed again, as they tend to do when you're in the industry. And we've actually had an opportunity to do some work together through the Bustleton Hospice Group. And she leads the grief support groups that are there and does a lot of training. And what I've come to learn in my own growth in this area is that grief and bereavement is something we can learn about. I mean, it's something that can be contemplated beforehand, and there are professionals that are trained that really make a difference to the grief and bereavement process. And the only excuse I have that I haven't spent more time in that area is that I tend to work with people before, and then, a person has passed, and then I'm out of the picture, really. But I want to learn her skills and be better at supporting others and preparing myself for losses that we all will face in life. So with that, I want to introduce you to Leanne, and we'll do a little bit talking about grief and bereavement. There she is. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Claire. Lovely to spend this morning with you.
Thank you so much. I'm just so thrilled for my audience to meet you. You made such an impression with me, and I just know you will with them as well. I honestly don't know where to begin with grief and bereavement. I've had my own challenges in my own life in doing it poorly. And I think what is so, one of the reasons why I do it poorly is I don't really know what to say, because all the cliches have been said. So how does someone that really wants to support people when they're going through a tough time avoid cliches?
I really love this question, Claire, and I was aware that this question was going to come up, so I put a little bit of thought into it. And there really is no right or wrong way. In our humanity, we share very common concerns. We all do. We all step into the messiness of grief, and our struggles regarding the vulnerability of death and our understanding of grief and bereavement is within us all. So I'm not convinced that there's a sequence of words that even exist. I think we need to be human. I think we need to be able to sit in the messiness of grief. And, when someone dies, we really just need to look grief in the eye and be able to share my condolences, or I'm sorry for your loss. Say it sincerely, say it with meaning, because that says, I see you, I see your grief. I really don't believe that, I think it's important just to be human and to be there in their presence. Yeah. Any word is significant in connecting with them. And in their pain, they're going to take things the wrong way. But if we can detach from their pain and just acknowledge that that is the space that they're in, then we won't feel that we're doing anything right or wrong. We can just be with them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of people that come through the hospice center or, you know, through your grief and bereavement center. I mean, are you basically there to counsel them, support them? What it actually happens when you're working with someone?
Sure. So what I've come to learn is that in my work, I encourage everyone to step into the discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something in Western culture that nobody wants to do. Yet in one's lifetime, we're going to experience 1,000 joys and 1,000 sorrows. We can't have one without the other. They go together. Life and death go together. So let's get into the messiness of what life throws at us. And the joys and sorrows are sometimes going to be out of balance. And it's about connecting with people within our community that can support us to find that balance again. And once we understand that we need both and our life story is going to have a mixture of all of it, then we need to step into the discomfort of life itself.
Yeah.
And grief is one of them that we are all going to experience.
So, well, go ahead.
I just wanted to share that through the work that I do, I really find it to be education. And once I share with people the importance of grief, the importance of our emotions, the importance of expression and awareness and understanding, they feel relieved that, oh, it's okay for me to take this journey. So education, I'm very comfortable with emotions. I think we need to relearn the importance of emotions.
Yeah.
And, you know, for a lot of family members, they get concerned when there are strong emotions. But for me, in that professional setting, I've seen the power of allowing someone to fully let go and really express their emotions.
Well, they've got to have the vocabulary to name it. You know, I mean, I when you say we generally just need to have a higher emotional intelligence or a higher vocabulary, emotional vocabulary. I mean, you know, and I don't want to be gender stereotype here, but men particularly seem to have a harder time getting into the levels of fear, the levels of hate, the levels of anger, the levels of love. I mean, there's just so many different, and so what I'm hearing you say is that people come to be relieved when they can articulate what it is that they're feeling. And I'm guessing you support them to do that.
Yeah, and there's many ways. And I think, you know, everyone has a story, but in their story of grief, there's layers to that. And one thing that I find a lot of people find comfort in is starting to explore their micro losses.
Oh,
and, yeah.
Give me an example of explore a micro loss.
So you've been married for 57 years and your husband's just died. And you find that on a daily basis, you think that you're coping and you're stepping back into the routine of life. You're sleeping well, you're cooking, you're catching up with friends, you're going about your daily duties and you think you're coping quite well. And then there'll be a day where it all just falls apart. And I'll give you a really good example is I had a client who had lost her daughter to a brain tumour. For 2 years, she'd been, you know, going about her daily activity of going grocery shopping. But there was one day she was down the cereal aisle, saw rice bubbles and broke down and came and saw me straight away. Why was it that it took 2 years? What was it that day going down the cereal aisle, it reminded her of her daughter? It was her favourite cereal. So there's many examples of that. And that's what we come to realise is that It could have been that you sat with your husband on a Sunday morning and had your cuppa on the back veranda, and it was a routine that you did for 30 years. Your husband paid the electrical bill. He changed the light bulb in the house. So it's all those micro moments of what within your routine over 57 years that is unconscious, on an unconscious level. And so it's more that you might be walking down the hallway and you get a real sense of something that's now missing because it was just something that was done constantly throughout the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And walking down the hallway, you get a sense that he's not sitting in the chair in the corner anymore, that you're not buying Tim Tams anymore because it was his favourite food. And so
that's an Aussie chocolate, by the way, Tim Tams.
Yeah, so, you know, and I think that once people become aware of that, they start to share their own stories of what they're missing and what they valued so much in their routine of life that seemed quite minimal. But now that it's missing, it's very significant.
Yeah, I had heard someone close to me who had lost their wife of 62 years, and he just said, you just can't sleep in the same bed with someone for 62 years. And basically that's an empty side of the bed now, and it not affect you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because, you know, for 51 years you rolled over a certain way to speak to them, and it's on such an unconscious level. We're not aware of it until it's no longer there.
Yeah.
So to have the space to explore and express and understand and really just pull it apart and then put all the pieces of it back together again, we develop a deeper understanding of ourselves. And I think that's the work that I enjoy doing the most, is allowing someone to fully understand themselves in their grief. And also too, with everyone's story of grief, there's elements of other traumatic events or, you know, discomforts throughout their life story that contribute to their grief. So it's not just the death of a loved one, but there's stories of the loved one, stories of events that contribute to the grief. So it's their overall story. It's not just the end outcome.
Yeah. 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 And they'll never be the same person afterwards. I mean, some people tend to assimilate that new identity easier, I guess, than others. But what about the coaching or the things that need to be encouraged if people are doing a DIY thing of grief, do it yourself, you know, to be resilient after the fact or accept your new identity?
Yeah, and I think really I shouldn't be in a job, in that I think that resilience comes from a community-based approach.
Oh, explain that.
Explain that, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're a very disconnected society now. Do we know our neighbours? You know, do we connect with our community in the way in which we did generations before us? You know, do we really know how to ask for help? Do we know how to come together and support someone in grief? And I really don't think that as a community we do. We kind of think that as long as our little patch of green grass is going okay, we don't really want to venture outside of that. And as you know, my role with Compassionate Communities is about educating the community on what to do when someone is caring, grieving or dying. And I am very passionate about that work because I've always worked within my community. I've lived in some incredible communities that really demonstrate what it takes to support a community in tragic events. When I lived up north in the Kimberley, many tragic events, and witnessing how the community came together was the absolute key to feeling that you are a part of something that really is just giving you one big hug in that moment. But it's
so when you say disconnected communities, talk about specifically what a community does that you would identify as them coming together? Because if you're a disconnected community, you don't even know what that is.
That's right,
Yeah.
absolutely. You've never experienced it yourself. And so I think, you know, if we break that down, I know for where I live, the neighbours, we live in obviously on, you know, on acreage, and so everyone keeps to themselves and really they don't connect at all. But I do know of some little pockets in the southwest where the street comes together and has a street barbecue.
Mm.
So doing something so social in those joyous occasions, when the sorrow comes in to a family member on that street, they know how to come together. So like I said before, the balance between the joys and the sorrows, that street that have a yearly barbecue, and I know of one street that have a lasagna cook-off once a year, which I think is just absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
You know, they're connecting in that common ground, and they're showing that, you know, they're a compassionate community by putting tables on their street, blocking their street off, coming together in a joyous way. But when the sorrow comes into a neighbour or a friend down the road, that connection and that common bond allows them to come together. They're not afraid to knock on the door. They're not afraid to go and take a meal down to them or get the lawnmower out and just mow the lawn without even knowing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Taking a dog for a walk.
I see that so much here in Australia, that people do that without mowing the lawn, without even asking their neighbor, do you want your lawn mowed, you know, or watering it. Having, you know, barbecues. Well, that happens in the States too, but it was more common when I was growing up, you know, in the 50s and the 60s, that there was that kind of social interaction. And it's, yeah, we've gotten, well, I think social media has a lot to do with it too, but and let's talk about the impact of social media on grief too, because I've seen some really horrendous things that have been like announcing someone has died without the inner circle knowing first, and they're finding out about it on social media. I mean, it can be a tool, but it can also be harmful.
Yes. And look, I always share, you know, social media is very positive for me, but I choose what to follow. So I choose what I want to come up in my news feed.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with you is that everyone is very quick to comment. You know, recently we had a young girl go missing in WA, and, you know, absolutely distressing for her parents. She was taken from a tent, as you probably are aware, when they were
4-year-old girl.
What I found really concerning was people quickly jumping to conclusions and judging and making comments that just aren't really helpful to developing what we talk about as a compassionate community, and very harmful to the community that's involved, obviously, in the, you know, at that time when she was missing. Thankfully, she's now been found. But I think that's a really good example is, you know, the amount of comments that were thrown at that negatively is harmful, and it's not achieving anything.
Yeah, and they were all proven wrong. Because I think what you're referring to is they were basically being suspicious, if not blaming the parents, one or both of the parents. And I can't imagine losing a child or fearing you've lost a child, or that a child is in somebody's hands that's been kidnapped, and then that comes back on you. And they are, yeah.
And I just think we all have a personal responsibility to contribute to the way that we support our community. There's enough going on in the world at the moment that now more than ever, I think that we need to be able to put our hands on our heart and honestly ask ourselves, are we contributing to a compassionate community? And just going back to communities coming together and supporting those in tragedy, I see it all the time at the hospice. I ask many of my clients that are obviously quite elderly and have just lost their husband or their wife. Do they have connections? No, they're actually, a vast majority of people are very lonely and isolated. I share a beautiful story of a street that have found a way to come together and support each other. But I can share with you that that's only the minority. There are so many living in our community that are lonely, isolated, don't have connections with their neighbours, family, friends. And research has shown that loneliness is more harmful to your health and actually causes more death than cigarette smoking. And so, that's my purpose, in the work that I do, is so at the hospice, we have so many programs to bring them together and find ways to re-engage them back in their community and find those connections and, those like-minded, people that have similar circumstances to them. And it makes the huge difference.
And I see that. It's great that that's provided. And I'm also thinking that there needs to be a conscious effort before a grief event happens to have that support system in place. And when I'm working with people, that are going through things, I'm actually encouraging them to reach out beyond their family and beyond their work family and develop connections, hobbies, book clubs, whatever, just so they know people, and are there other things, or can you expand on that about being prepared for grief?
I've been doing a lot of work this year on end-of-life support, which naturally then rolls into grief work. And it was only a couple of weeks ago that I had feedback for a family that I was working with in the hospice unit, where this gentleman's wife only had a couple of days, and I was encouraged to go and sit with them. And I do ask those very confronting, difficult questions. And like I shared earlier, I do encourage them to step into the discomfort, but they always find comfort. And the feedback that he shared with one of my colleagues was, gee, that Leanne, she's a bit forward, isn't she? And it was sort of something along those lines of, and I was like, well, I never really saw myself as someone that was really forward. But then his comment was, but I'm so grateful because no one has ever asked those questions. And I've never engaged in a conversation like I had with Leanne, but it was so comforting for my wife and I. And I'm so forever grateful that 3 days before she died, I was able to engage in that conversation with my wife. So I took it as an absolute honour that I played that part. But you've also got to remember that, that age group, that generation, they never spoke about things that, this generation can talk about many things, but they grew up in a generation that you just don't talk about things. But I'm seeing that a lot. But I'm seeing now that the pre-grief work, and certainly the work that I do with the MMD Association.
What is the MMD Association?
Motor Neurone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I work with the Motor Neurone Association in WA, Queensland and Victoria. And of course, from day of diagnosis, the family are experiencing grief and they're starting to lose a lot as the disease progresses. It's a horrible disease.
Yeah.
And of course, the family are just focused on caring for and comforting the loved one with the disease and the family members around them as they adjust to their life changing so much on a daily basis as they care for their loved one with MND. But when I come in and support them and give them the space and the opportunity to really explore how they're going, they're absolutely grieving. And so once they have the opportunity to explore it and express it and acknowledge it, again, step into the discomfort, they always find comfort and find that a different version of themselves to be able to continually find the solutions to continue to cope in such difficult circumstances. And once they start opening up and having the conversation, as they journey towards death, they find it so much more comforting because they have the skills to just express and talk about it, because it's a language that they can now say out loud, where they haven't wanted to say out loud because they didn't want, unfortunately, the inevitable to happen.
Well, and I would assume that by stepping into the discomfort, starting to articulate your feelings, and getting that elephant that sits in the room out of the room,
Yeah.
then I'm guessing that that would lead to a more peaceful death.
Absolutely. Absolutely, because there's no more fear associated with it, because as we know, once we allow ourselves to release, and I do this a lot in my centre, is that a lot of body work, we hold our emotions in our physical self. And when we actually allow ourselves to verbally share, we find that all of our physical discomforts go away. So they start to feel better. And when they feel better from expressing, they cope better, they adapt to change. They start to see a future where, yes, they understand there's a future with pain, but also there's a future of a joyous understanding of the process.
Yeah. So part of where I met you and things that we've done together was with there is an organization, I guess you'd call it, of compassionate communities, which you have been very much a part of here in the Bunbury-Bustleton region. And I think it's a great model that other communities, could latch onto across the globe. So tell us, the audience, about what a compassionate community is.
Well, I think what we're trying to do at the community is encourage our community to not try and escape the pain of grief, but actually make yourself at home with it, because we're all going to die. And this is what I share with my M&D families, is that I could actually go tomorrow. So the more that we understand the importance that life and death go together, who's to say that, because we don't know, but death could actually be joyous. It's only a sorrow for the ones left behind.
But in a compassionate community, as it's there is some structure to it. Is it connected to social programs? What is it that's provided if you are designated a compassionate community?
So Compassionate Communities is a global program that's really encouraging community members to establish programs to support those at end of life and in grief and bereavement. So as you know, in the Southwest, we hold regular death cafes, and death cafes are an opportunity to have a cuppa, ask questions, and start having the conversation. And what I find, the Death Cafe is a really good example that everyone attends now just feels really comfortable in that space and that conversation. It's not an uncomfortable space to be in anymore. With our Dying to Know Day that we have annually, we've now ran that for 4 years. And that's one thing that I have really observed the most. Many go, I'm not quite sure that I really want to spend my day at an event where we talk about death and dying, grief and bereavement. But they come and join us. And by the end of the day, they're so grateful that they attended. They learnt so much and realised that it's actually an important conversation, and it actually made them feel quite, aware of the importance. And in that importance, they felt a responsibility, and in that responsibility, they felt that they could make a difference.
Yeah, and it has a ripple effect. If there's one person that leaves that day and they are excited to share the aha moments that they had, and they're sharing it with 2 or 3 other people, then that is like, oh yeah, maybe I do need to have an advanced care plan. Oh yeah, maybe I could explore having a green burial. I mean, all the different things that, could come up. Let's find some place to do art therapy to kind of work on. I mean, there's just this is the thing that blows me away, is that there are so many different subsets and subgroups and subtopics of grief and bereavement. And grief and bereavement is kind of a subtopic of death and dying. And it just goes on and on and on and on. And who knows what people are going to be attracted to. But if it makes them have a conversation with their loved ones, with their friends, it has a ripple effect.
And Claire, I want to share with you, this only happened last week. My children don't really want to know what I do. They're 21 and 23. Do they want to be talking about death and dying? No. So that mum just does that over there. But my son moved home on last week, and I asked him to join me on Sunday as I was hosting a remembrance service. Now, we had over 100 people attend, and it was really beautiful. And my son got to witness that. And he had so many elderly people within the community come up and speak to him that he took away so much from that day. That again, I think it's important that we acknowledge that all age groups need to engage in these conversations. And again, this year when we hosted the WA Forum, we weren't quite sure the outcome of that day. As you know, that was a full day of speakers and a full day of engaging in the conversation of death and dying, grief and bereavement. We had 180 people in the room. That could have gone pear-shaped, but it actually was the opposite. No one wanted to leave. So what is that saying about the importance of this conversation?
Yeah, the highlight of that day for me was the Mayor of Albany, who spoke, and he was talking to this, very full room, sitting around tables. It was a lovely affair. But he was talking about how Albany has actually, this is a city down south in southwestern Australia. It's south. And they have approached, even with their building codes now, that all new building is built to purpose for aged care, living in place, aging in place. And just, that there is someone at that level that is already thinking, envisioning. We have an older population, and it's going to be that silver tsunami. And what are we going to do to support them to stay at home as long as possible? Well, we'll just change the building codes. I love that.
Yes. And he was very authentic.
Yeah.
In the way that he shared that, the City Council have a role to play in a compassionate community. So Albany do some brilliant work, and they really are leading the way in Australia. And it's what we call a city charter. And so our current network here in Bunbury are now working with the City Council to develop the same. So that was really the successful outcome from the forum, was there were key community members that sat up from that forum and went, wow, we need to do more. And from there, I think my work is going to extend into compassionate workplaces, compassionate schools.
Oh, wow.
And what does that look like? As you probably know, at the forum, we had 3 schools that contributed to a project, and that project was then on display at the forum. And that was over a 12-month period where we worked with those schools, and I went in and spoke to the students that were participating in the project. And I just all courage and praise to the 3 schools that stood up and said, this is important. A lot of other schools were like, no, we don't want to touch it.
Thank you, no.
But if you remember, the young people that got up and spoke at that forum were very comfortable in talking about their grief. And there were a number of young people that got up and spoke that day. And I know that they were very inspirational to a lot of other people in the room that recognise that we all have a responsibility to, you know, really step out of the discomfort that we've been living in for such a long time around this subject, and really acknowledge that it's an important conversation. As Western culture, I think it's also important to acknowledge that we don't really have a culture, we don't have rituals, and if we look at other countries around the world, they actually do death and dying really well, and that's because they have rituals that bring them together in processes, and processes in grief are really important.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I mean, we go to a funeral that might last for about an hour, and it's like, okay, now I'm supposed to be fine. And that's really just about it.
That's right. And really all we do in Australian culture is drink beer.
Well, that can help, but then it can be a problem. But
it can be a massive problem, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think compassionate communities, and also what I wanted to share about compassionate communities, even I learned so much. So at the death cafes, we have guest speakers, and we invite, you know, many from different areas of the community. And one day we had the ambulance come and speak. And I had a really important question, because I often consider this. My husband works away a lot, so I'm here on my own, but we have an electric gate and then a dog and then a locked front door. So if something was to happen to me, how would they even get to me? And he shared with me, which I would say a lot of community members don't know this, but you can actually register with the ambulance the details of getting into your property. And so again, having these conversations develops awareness, it develops the strategies to feel comfortable in your
just
vulnerability.
The practical things, and things that don't cost any money, but could make the difference between life and death.
Yeah. And so now I don't live in vulnerability. I don't live in worry about what I would do if something happened.
Yeah.
Because, simply asking a question and finding the means, and, you know, these community members that come together to have these conversations, we develop awareness, we develop a deeper understanding. And probably the most rewarding part of my role in the community and in the work that I do is seeing people develop their own self-confidence. Their self-awareness allows them to be better humans in our community.
Yeah, and I think it's just so important we're having this conversation, but that people that are hearing it have similar conversations with their friends and with their communities. You know, we can't have too many conversations. And I found that, you know, if you're challenged talking to someone in your family, perhaps it is uncomfortable talking about death and dying or grieving, anything around those topics, just little bite-sized pieces, you know, it opens the door. And then later on, just keeping it very organic and non-threatening, and just allowing those doors to open to have the conversation.
And to also remember that in your pain, you know your pain and other people don't. And so I think it's really important, because then we can detach with love from other people's behaviours, thoughts, comments, reactions. And it is a skill. It takes a lifetime to develop that skill, to be able to detach with love. But when we can honour our pain and honour our story without anyone else impacting on that. But yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother subject, but I think it's really important, because I see it all the time. I find that people are, I don't know if you can see me correctly, but I explain it this way, that a lot of people are always living out here. What are other people thinking? What are other people doing? What haven't I done? What have I done? You know, and we're always living out here. But if we just come back to here, it makes all the difference. And if we can just sit with ourselves in our pain even if it's just for a moment, we always will continue to move forward.
Yeah. You are so empathetic, and you just really have a softness about you, and approachable. You're approachable, and you have that. You kind of live in that space in your heart, but that can also be very vulnerable to live in that space. And how do you protect yourself? Do you have compassion fatigue? How do you, as a grief counselor, support yourself?
I think it's really important to have the conversation about compassion fatigue. I think for me, it's such important work, and it's an honour to work in this space. So for me, it goes beyond just a paid role. It goes to really sort of like a responsibility to our community. And because my community work has always been important to me, it's a real honour. But of course, I need to be aware of my own health. And I suppose when I think about my own self-care, I think about my beautiful family, which is a huge priority for me. And we, Pete and I love hiking. We love gardening. We love our home. And
going to festivals.
Lots of music, love dancing, love traveling when we can. But also, since the children have left home, I converted one of the bedrooms into my craft room, and it's my playroom. And am I good at creative play?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. I love it.
Yeah.
And, Pete's got his shed, and I've got my little creative space. And I think that's important. Everyone needs that creative space, whether it's in the kitchen, cooking, in the gardening with your veggie garden, or, creative play. And I do a lot of creative play work with my clients. Sorry, I was going to sneeze. So, of course, and integrity is important to me. And what I've learned over my years with my career is my integrity to my work is important. And people ask me, is it what's really important to you? And work and family, I would have to say, are balanced. And I don't feel guilty saying that, because they both mean so much to me.
Mm-hmm.
But who I am in my personal life is who I am in my professional life. So my integrity to who I am, and how I show up in the world. And it takes a constant balance, constant learning. We never stop learning, and we never stop, developing awareness of ourselves and our patterns of behaviour and the choices that we make. That's one book that I want to write one day, is The Power of Choice.
Yeah. And responsibility. Just, if everybody just took a responsibility for their self-care, but certainly for preparing for end of life, preparing for grief. And there's so many different, we could have this conversation go on for a long time. I wanted them to know more about the Southwest Grief and Bereavement Center, which you have, and it's lovely. I've been there. It's just a wonderful retreat site. Tell us what it is and what's coming up in the future.
Well, this year I've been so busy with so many projects with other organisations that the centre sort of has been a little bit neglected. I do a lot of private client work here at the centre, but I think for next year I want to focus on the centre. I used to run a lot of workshops here, deliver training, and I would like to get back to that. So that's my focus for next year, is really bringing back my work to the centre instead of taking myself away and working up in Perth and down in Busselton. Of course, my work with the hospice will always remain. I deliver training, workshops. I also want to increase my online platform. I want to do a lot more internationally. I'm obviously doing statewide now.
Yeah.
And up until COVID, if you'd asked me would I do sessions on Zoom, I would have said no. I really like that personal connection, you know, in person. But since COVID, and obviously the need to do a lot more on Zoom, I find that my work on Zoom is just as powerful as
Yeah, I find that too. I can do 75% of my work online.
Yeah.
I mean, the only thing I can't do is vigiling, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, so I would like to increase my capacity to do a lot more work online and, you know, do a lot more of these, you know, developing educational programs like this, just podcasts and having those conversations more and more. So next year, I think it's about me stepping back into the creativity of what my business looks like rather than providing the services outside of my centre. I also want to develop a program for compassionate workplaces. So work with the Chamber of Commerce about developing education. If you remember at the forum, I asked everyone in the room if they were aware that their workplace had a grief policy. Out of 180 people, only 2 people put their hand up.
Wow. And those policies are in place or they're not in place?
So they're not in place. Only 2 had policies in place and saw the importance of acknowledging grief and bereavement in their workplace. And I think the reason why I'm very passionate about improving workplace awareness is that it has a ripple effect. So Susie down the corridor that works in the office downstairs, but knows of a staff member upstairs that just lost their husband. To management, why has it impacted Susie downstairs? Just get on with your work. But we don't know Susie's story downstairs and how it has impacted her greatly, whether it has, you know, she's re-identified a grief that happened many, many years ago, or she's questioning her own mortality. So being able to come together as a community in that workplace and compassionately share makes a huge difference to their emotional, physical and mental well-being in that workplace. And I think that example goes back to why I established the Southwest Grief and Loss Centre. So years ago, I was a general counselling practitioner, and I identified that in everyone's story, there was an element of grief, loss of a job, loss of finances, loss of a marriage, and of course, loss through death and many other losses. And of course, the grief response is important for any kind of loss. So I found that everyone had a story of loss, and yet the elephant in the room in our community is not allowing ourselves to grieve for something that other people might see quite insignificant. Yeah. Loss of a pet can be a huge loss for some people, and it needs to be honoured. So from there was a car accident that was very tragic, and it was filmed live on Facebook, and it was very graphic, and obviously Facebook have changed their rules now, but had a massive impact on our community. And I was seeing people daily that were so impacted by what they saw. Now, they didn't know the people involved in that accident, but as a community, we all knew because we visually saw it unfold, the impact, everything on social media. So there were people that stopped driving because they didn't know what they would do if they were driving down the road and someone was driving towards them in the wrong lane. They started to question their own mortality. They started
Tell me they weren't American.
No.
Bad joke.
And so I started to see that for everyone in our community, they had nowhere to go to talk about this tragic event in our community. It was just get on with your life. But I think it's important that sometimes we stop, and where do these people go to? So I recognised that we needed to do more in this space of grief, and I always knew that that's where my work would lead, and obviously it has, and I'm very proud to be working in this space.
Well, I am just so grateful that we met, and you're my friend and that we cross paths frequently. And it's just always a delight to see you. And you've made my work better.
You
You
know,
have. You've made my work better. And I really appreciate you for that.
no,
I
thank you.
really do.
And you have too, because I think I really, really admire the work that you do and the way that, you know, you show up in this space and share it in the platform that you do. So you've taught me a lot as well. And I think we all have, everyone is our teacher.
Yeah.
Well,
We'll have to find ways to collaborate more, because I think there's a real your strengths are not I mean, you have strengths that I don't have, you know, and I just really I need to get more comfortable in that space after someone has died, you know. I really do. Because I can think of my own, you know, my own losses and really dysfunctional ways. Now I'm going back to the 1980s, but dysfunctional ways that I dealt with it. And I don't know if I finished dealing with it. You know, I mean, I had a husband that died, and my children, you know, I was so immersed in my own death, I mean, my own grief, that I just really did not show up for them. And I regret that so much. You know, I really regret it, but you can't turn back the clock. But that's, you know, maybe another topic is just talking about complicated grief, because it's, you know, situations, our lives aren't tidy. They're not like that Dick and Jane and the dog Spot and the cat Puff. I mean, we don't live lives like that anymore. And
do we actually want that?
Well, it's the paradigm that I was raised in, Leanna, was that was how we should be living. Even if we weren't living like that, that's how we should be living. And if you weren't living like that and you had suffered a grief or loss, then it wasn't acknowledged by the community in the same way, you know, because there was some judgment in there.
Yeah.
I think that there is judgment sometimes in grief. That's absolutely so painful.
And I think, you know, I experienced the same with when my mum died. And unfortunately, there wasn't a relationship that was there for, you know, a very, very long time. And so, of course, what place did I have? But, you know, that's a story in itself, is that I showed up and I honoured and I loved her in that space of grief. And I was a demonstration to my family and my children through the story that we have. And sometimes the stories that we have are not the ones that we want. But I showed up. And by showing up, and it's because it's such a long story, but so much good come from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where other family members didn't attend because they weren't involved in her life, so why would I go to her funeral? But I felt that it was important, regardless of someone's story, she was still my mum.
Yeah.
As difficult as it was. And so, yeah, it taught me a lot. And a lot of good comes from it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Leanne, for taking time with us today. It's just, I'm so glad people got to meet you. And if they want to reach out to you, what is the best way for them to contact you?
The website, email, Facebook page, Southwest Grief and Loss Centre.
And we'll have those links. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course they can call me anytime. And I think that's really important, is that I make myself available to the community. And, you know, whether that's identifying a service that's right for them, it may not necessarily always be my services, but of being available to the community to help them find what's right for them.
And that number's on the website, correct? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Leanne. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Claire. It's been a joy.